I was setting up my presentation slides in the Portland Convention Center when my phone buzzed with what seemed like a casual text from my wife Autumn. The message hit me like a freight train during the biggest medical device sales conference of my career. I'd been traveling for work for 3 years, selling cardiac monitoring systems to hospitals across the Pacific Northwest, and Autumn had never complained about my trips. She'd always encouraged my career advancement and seemed proud when I landed the regional territory that came with a substantial salary increase and the potential for executive promotion within our Denver-based company. But there I was, about to present our latest breakthrough technology to potential hospital clients who could generate millions in revenue for our growing medical device firm, when she dropped this bomb through a simple text message that felt anything but simple or spontaneous in its timing and delivery. The timing felt calculated and cruel. She waited until I was 2,000 miles away, surrounded by colleagues and potential clients, unable to have a real conversation or emotional response, to casually inform me that she'd already told our friends, family, neighbors, and probably half of Denver that we were taking a break to work on ourselves and discover our individual paths forward without each other. I stared at my phone in the crowded convention hall, surrounded by the noise of medical equipment demonstrations and sales pitches from competitors trying to steal my clients, feeling completely blindsided by her choice of words and the deliberate timing of her announcement that would fundamentally change everything about our life together. She mentioned heading to some spiritual awakening retreat in Sedona with her meditation group, framing it as necessary personal growth and consciousness expansion rather than relationship problems we needed to solve together as a married couple who'd taken vows to work through difficulties and support each other through challenging times and life transitions. I'd always supported her interest in mindfulness and meditation. It seemed healthy and positive, especially given her stressful job as a marketing coordinator at a wellness company in Denver where she dealt with demanding clients and tight deadlines while trying to promote products she claimed aligned with her personal values and spiritual beliefs. But this felt different and more ominous, like she was using spiritual language and concepts to justify something she'd already decided without consulting me or giving me any opportunity to understand what was happening in her mind or our marriage that had seemed stable just weeks earlier when we discussed vacation plans. The casual way she delivered life-changing news through a text message made me realize she'd been planning this moment for weeks or maybe months, waiting for the perfect opportunity when I couldn't immediately respond or have a real conversation about what was happening to our relationship and our shared future together as partners. Standing in that convention center, trying to process her words while maintaining my professional composure for the most important presentation of my career, I felt a strange mixture of shock, betrayal, confusion, and analytical clarity that would define how I handled everything that followed over the next several months of legal and emotional warfare. My presentation went smoothly despite the emotional earthquake she'd triggered from across the country, and I spent the rest of the conference mechanically going through the motions of networking and client meetings while my mind raced through the implications of her carefully timed announcement and what it meant for our future together as partners and spouses. The retreat she mentioned sounded expensive and exclusive, the kind of spiritual experience that costs thousands of dollars and promises life transformation to wealthy seekers looking for meaning and purpose in their privileged lives while charging premium prices for ancient wisdom and guided meditation sessions. I found myself wondering how she planned to fund this sudden journey of self-discovery, especially since I'd been covering most of our major expenses including our Denver condo mortgage, utilities, insurance, and her car payment while she pursued what she called her spiritual development over the past several months with increasing intensity, secrecy, and financial demands that I'd supported without question. Something about the whole situation felt orchestrated rather than spontaneous, like she'd been building toward this moment while keeping me completely in the dark about her true intentions, feelings about our relationship, and whatever plans she'd been making for her future that apparently didn't include me as an equal partner in major life decisions that would affect both of our lives significantly. I spent the flight back to Denver analyzing the situation like any complex sales presentation, breaking down the timeline of events that had led to Autumn's carefully orchestrated announcement. The warning signs had been there for months, but I'd been too busy supporting what I thought was her genuine spiritual growth to recognize them as exit strategies disguised as personal development and consciousness expansion. It started 6 months earlier when she discovered this meditation group led by someone called River, a self-proclaimed spiritual advisor who charged $200 per session for what he called chakra alignment and energy healing work that would transform her entire life perspective and unlock her authentic spiritual potential. Autumn had always been interested in wellness and mindfulness, but this felt different, more intense, secretive, and expensive than anything she'd explored before in her journey towards spiritual enlightenment and personal transformation. She began attending weekly sage-burning ceremonies at Rivers Healing Center, expensive crystal workshops that cost more than our monthly grocery budget, and weekend retreats that required overnight stays at luxury mountain resorts where participants paid premium prices for ancient wisdom and guided meditation experiences designed to awaken their higher consciousness. I'd supported these activities financially and emotionally, thinking they were helping her deal with stress from her marketing job and personal growth goals she'd mentioned wanting to pursue for years as part of her journey toward becoming her most authentic self. But looking back during that long flight home, I realized how systematically she'd been withdrawing from our relationship while building this alternative life filled with spiritual seekers and consciousness explorers who seemed to validate her growing dissatisfaction with our supposedly mundane existence together as a conventional married couple. The secretive phone calls with River had become daily occurrences, always taking place when she thought I was distracted by work or occupied with other tasks around our Denver condo. She'd step outside or go into the bedroom, speaking in hushed tones about energy blocks, spiritual awakening processes, and personal transformation journeys that apparently required complete separation from negative influences in her current environment, specifically anyone who didn't understand her elevated spiritual path. I'd assumed these conversations were therapeutic sessions, similar to traditional counseling, but the frequency and secrecy suggested something more personal and intimate than professional guidance about meditation techniques and spiritual practices designed to help her achieve inner peace. Her social media presence had gradually shifted from photos of us together to pictures of her glowing at various wellness events, always surrounded by the same group of spiritual seekers I'd never met despite her claims that I'd love their positive energy and enlightened perspectives on life, love, and personal fulfillment. She posted inspirational quotes about releasing toxic energy, breaking free from limiting beliefs, and finding your authentic self that seemed directed at someone specific rather than general spiritual wisdom for her followers who were presumably seeking their own paths to enlightenment. The expensive workshops and retreats were funded through our shared savings account, money we'd accumulated for a down payment on a house and future family planning that apparently no longer aligned with her evolved spiritual priorities and higher consciousness goals. I'd noticed the withdrawals but trusted her explanations about investing in personal growth and consciousness expansion that would benefit our relationship long-term through her increased self-awareness and emotional healing work with qualified spiritual guides. River's influence became increasingly apparent in her language, her priorities, and her growing criticism of my supposedly materialistic focus on career advancement and financial stability that she claimed were blocking her spiritual development and preventing her from accessing higher levels of consciousness and authentic living. She started questioning my values, my goals, and my understanding of what truly mattered in life, comparing my practical approach to River's enlightened perspective on abundance, consciousness, and authentic living that transcended conventional societal expectations and material concerns. The meditation group became her primary social circle, replacing long-time friendships with people who apparently understood her spiritual journey better than anyone from her previous life, including me as her husband and supposed life partner who clearly lacked the spiritual awareness to support her transformation. She'd return from their gatherings energized and glowing, but distant from me in ways that felt permanent rather than temporary mood shifts related to spiritual practices and personal growth work that should have brought us closer together as partners. The most telling sign was how she began speaking about our relationship in clinical terms, describing our connection as energetically mismatched and spiritually incompatible, language that sounded suspiciously similar to River's teaching style and philosophy about relationships being vehicles for mutual spiritual evolution. Instead of panicking or chasing after Autumn with desperate phone calls and emotional pleas to reconsider our relationship, I decided to treat her announcement like any other business challenge that required careful analysis, strategic planning, and methodical execution of a comprehensive response plan. My years in medical device sales had taught me to remain calm under pressure, gather all available information, and develop a systematic approach that protected my interests while maintaining professional composure throughout the most challenging negotiations and high-stakes business transactions. The analytical skills that made me successful at closing million-dollar hospital contracts would serve me well in navigating whatever legal and financial complications Autumn's spiritual awakening retreat was about to create for both of us in terms of asset division and future financial obligations. I spent the weekend researching divorce attorneys in Denver, focusing specifically on lawyers who specialized in financial fraud and asset protection cases where one spouse had been systematically deceiving the other about money, intentions, and future plans while continuing to benefit from shared resources and joint financial accounts. Sebastian Chen came highly recommended by 3 different colleagues who'd gone through complicated divorces involving hidden assets and deceptive behavior patterns similar to what I suspected Autumn had been orchestrating for months while pretending our marriage was simply going through a temporary rough patch that could be resolved through individual spiritual work. His initial consultation confirmed my worst suspicions about the legal and financial vulnerabilities I faced if Autumn had indeed been planning this separation while continuing to spend our shared money on her spiritual journey and whatever relationship she developed with River during those secretive daily phone calls that had become increasingly frequent and intimate over recent months. Chen advised me to immediately begin documenting everything: bank statements, credit card records, text messages, social media posts, and any other evidence that could demonstrate a pattern of deception and financial misconduct that might constitute grounds for fault-based divorce proceedings where asset division could be influenced by proven misconduct. I contacted our mortgage lender to discuss removing my name from our jointly owned condo, a conversation that revealed Autumn had already called them twice in the past month asking about refinancing options and equity calculations that suggested she'd been planning to either buy me out or force a sale without my knowledge or consent. The bank representative seemed relieved to speak with me directly, mentioning that Autumn's questions had raised some red flags about potential fraud or financial elder abuse that they were required to report if they suspected someone was being manipulated or coerced into signing documents or making major financial decisions under duress or deception. I began the process of separating our intertwined finances, starting with our shared savings account where I discovered Autumn had been making increasingly large withdrawals over the past 3 months, money that had supposedly gone towards spiritual workshops and retreat fees but totaled more than $8,000 in expenses I'd never specifically approved or discussed with her beforehand. The detailed transaction history painted a clear picture of someone who'd been systematically draining our joint resources while planning an exit strategy that would leave me financially vulnerable and legally disadvantaged if I didn't act quickly to protect my interests and document her deceptive financial behavior patterns. Her spending pattern showed a clear escalation that coincided with her increased contact with River and the meditation group, suggesting these expensive spiritual experiences were either covering costs for something else entirely or funding a lifestyle she intended to maintain after leaving our marriage through alimony or asset division claims. I hired a private investigator to conduct surveillance on Autumn's activities during her supposed spiritual retreat in Sedona, specifically focusing on verifying whether she was actually attending legitimate workshops or using the retreat as cover for other activities that might constitute adultery or financial fraud that could impact divorce proceedings. The investigator, a former police detective named Marcus Webb, specialized in marital infidelity cases and had extensive experience documenting evidence that would hold up in court proceedings where financial settlements and asset division were contested based on misconduct by one spouse who had violated their marital obligations through deception or infidelity. Webb's preliminary research into River's background revealed some interesting inconsistencies in his credentials and business practices that suggested his spiritual guidance operation might be more focused on financial exploitation than authentic healing work. I systematically dismantled our shared financial life with the same methodical approach I used for complex hospital contract negotiations, treating each account separation and asset protection measure as a critical component of a comprehensive business strategy designed to minimize my losses and maximize my legal advantages in whatever proceedings were coming. The process required careful timing and strategic thinking, especially since Autumn was posting Instagram stories about releasing toxic energy and embracing abundance consciousness from her luxury Sedona retreat, while I dealt with the practical reality of untangling 3 years of intertwined finances and shared responsibilities that had become increasingly complicated over time. I started by visiting our primary bank branch to speak with Patricia Collins, a senior account manager who'd handled our mortgage application and understood our complete financial picture better than the customer service representatives who typically dealt with routine banking transactions and standard account modifications without understanding the broader context. Patricia's expression grew increasingly concerned as I explained Autumn's sudden departure and my need to protect myself from potential financial fraud or unauthorized withdrawals that could drain our accounts, while she was supposedly discovering her authentic self in expensive spiritual workshops and consciousness expansion programs. The bank's fraud prevention protocols required both account holders to be present for major changes, but Patricia worked within the system to help me document suspicious activity patterns and implement protective measures that would prevent Autumn from accessing our joint savings account without my explicit consent or proper legal authorization through court proceedings. We discovered that Autumn had indeed been transferring money to pay for her spiritual journey through a series of smaller withdrawals designed to avoid triggering the bank's automatic fraud detection systems that monitored large or unusual transactions that might indicate potential financial abuse or elder fraud. The detailed financial records revealed payments to Rivers Healing Center, expensive crystal therapy sessions, luxury accommodation costs at resort-style retreat facilities, and various other spiritual wellness expenses that totaled nearly $12,000 over the past 4 months alone, money that could have covered a substantial house down payment or funded legitimate investment opportunities. Patricia helped me understand my legal options for recovering funds that had been spent without my knowledge or consent, particularly money that had been designated for our joint goals like house down payment savings and emergency fund contributions that we'd both agreed were off-limits for individual expenses or personal purchases. I opened new individual accounts at a different bank to ensure my salary deposits and personal expenses would remain completely separate from any financial chaos that Autumn's spiritual awakening might create upon her return from Sedona and whatever confrontation was inevitable when she discovered my protective measures. The credit card companies proved more challenging to work with, since our joint cards had been used for many of the questionable spiritual expenses that Autumn had charged without discussing the purchases with me beforehand or getting my approval for major expenditures that affected our shared credit limits. I had to provide detailed documentation proving that certain charges were unauthorized or made under false pretenses to begin the process of removing my liability for debts incurred through what I suspected was financial deception disguised as personal growth investments and consciousness expansion work. My attorney Sebastian Chen advised me to document every conversation with financial institutions, keeping detailed records of when I discovered unauthorized spending and what steps I'd taken to protect myself from further financial damage caused by Autumn's secret planning and deceptive behavior patterns that had escalated over recent months. The mortgage situation proved particularly complex since our Denver condo was jointly owned and both our names were on the deed and loan documents, creating a legal situation where neither of us could make unilateral decisions about selling, refinancing, or transferring ownership without the other's consent and legal cooperation. Chen explained that Autumn's previous inquiries about refinancing options could be used as evidence that she'd been planning this separation while continuing to live in our home and benefit from my financial support without disclosing her true intentions about our relationship's future or her plans to leave me. I began researching property values and refinancing options myself, not because I wanted to keep the condo necessarily, but because I needed to understand all my options before Autumn returned and potentially tried to manipulate the situation to her financial advantage through legal maneuvering or emotional manipulation designed to pressure me into unfavorable agreements that would benefit her post-divorce lifestyle. 3 weeks into Autumn's supposed spiritual retreat, I received the call from Marcus Webb that confirmed my worst suspicions and shattered any remaining illusions about my wife's integrity or the authenticity of her consciousness expansion journey in the sacred landscapes of Sedona. Web surveillance had uncovered a pattern of deception so elaborate and calculating that it made her original text announcement seem almost innocent by comparison to the systematic fraud she'd been orchestrating for months while living in our home and spending my money on what she claimed was personal growth and spiritual development. The spiritual awakening retreat in Sedona was indeed real, but it wasn't the group meditation and consciousness expansion program she described to me and documented on her carefully curated social media posts designed to maintain her cover story and convince friends and family that she was going through a legitimate spiritual crisis. Instead, it was an intimate romantic getaway at an upscale mountain cabin retreat where Autumn had been planning her new life with River while using our joint savings account to fund their luxurious accommodations and expensive spiritual activities that were apparently just elaborate dates disguised as professional healing sessions and consciousness expansion workshops. Webb's photographs showed them together in ways that left no doubt about the true nature of their relationship, holding hands during sunset walks along mountain trails, sharing intimate meals at expensive restaurants with romantic lighting and private seating, and engaging in behavior that was clearly romantic rather than the professional spiritual guidance relationship Autumn had claimed when explaining her frequent sessions and growing dependence on River's wisdom and healing expertise. The most damaging evidence came from financial records that Webb had obtained showing River's Healing Center had been charging Autumn's credit card for services that corresponded exactly with dates when they were photographed together at romantic locations throughout Colorado and Arizona, creating a comprehensive paper trail that proved their affair had been ongoing for at least 4 months while disguised as spiritual counseling sessions and energy healing work. River wasn't just taking advantage of vulnerable spiritual seekers for financial gain. He was running a sophisticated operation that preyed on married women going through spiritual crises, offering them emotional validation and romantic attention while convincing them to leave their husbands and fund new relationships through financial manipulation and elaborate cover stories about personal transformation and consciousness expansion. Webb discovered that Autumn wasn't River's first victim. There were at least 3 other women who'd gone through similar patterns of spiritual awakening that had led to expensive divorces and new relationships with River that had lasted just long enough to drain their divorce settlements before he moved on to his next target among wealthy clients seeking spiritual guidance and emotional healing. The retreat center operated as a front for these romantic manipulations, providing a legitimate-seeming business structure that could justify the expensive charges and frequent contact while River identified potential targets among women who were financially stable but emotionally vulnerable to his particular brand of spiritual guidance mixed with romantic attention and personal validation. When I confronted Autumn about Webb's evidence, she initially tried to maintain her cover story about spiritual growth and consciousness expansion, claiming the photographs were taken out of context and that River was simply a gifted healer who understood her spiritual needs better than anyone in her previous life, including her supposedly spiritually unaware husband who didn't support her journey toward authentic self-discovery. But when I presented the financial evidence showing the pattern of charges that corresponded with their romantic getaways, her facade finally cracked and she admitted that her spiritual journey had evolved into something deeper and more meaningful than traditional marriage could provide, though she refused to acknowledge the systematic deception and financial fraud she'd been committing against me for months. The confrontation revealed the full scope of her calculated betrayal. She'd been planning to use our joint savings to fund her transition into a new relationship while keeping me as financial backup security in case things didn't work out with River, essentially running a hedge strategy where she could explore her options without risking her comfortable lifestyle or financial stability that I'd provided throughout our marriage. She'd never intended the separation to be temporary or focused on individual spiritual growth. It was always meant to be the beginning of her new life with River, funded by money I'd worked years to save and invested in what I thought was our shared future together as married partners building something meaningful and lasting that would benefit both of us for decades to come. The spiritual awakening had been nothing more than an elaborate con game designed to justify her affair while maintaining access to my financial resources. Armed with Webb's evidence and my detailed financial documentation, I presented Sebastian Chen with a comprehensive case that transformed our divorce proceedings from a simple no-fault separation into a contested legal battle involving charges of financial fraud, adultery, and systematic deception that would have serious consequences for asset division and spousal support determinations throughout the entire proceedings. Chen's experience with similar cases proved invaluable as we built a strategy that would protect my financial interests while exposing the full scope of Autumn's calculated betrayal to the court system and anyone else who'd been manipulated by her spiritual awakening performance over the past several months while she lived in our home. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records showing unauthorized expenditures, surveillance photographs documenting her affair, and testimony from other women who'd fallen victim to River's systematic exploitation of vulnerable clients seeking spiritual guidance and emotional support during difficult periods in their marriages and personal lives. Chen filed motions claiming financial misconduct and seeking full recovery of funds that Autumn had spent on her affair, including the $12,000 she'd withdrawn from our joint accounts to fund her romantic getaways disguised as spiritual retreats and consciousness expansion workshops that had been nothing more than elaborate dates. The legal documents painted a clear picture of someone who'd systematically deceived her spouse while planning an exit strategy that involved draining shared resources to fund a new relationship with a man who specialized in preying on married women going through spiritual crises and emotional vulnerabilities that made them susceptible to manipulation. Autumn's family, who had initially supported her spiritual journey and even defended her decision to take time apart from our marriage to focus on personal growth and self-discovery, completely turned against her when they learned about the affair and the financial deception she'd been orchestrating while living in our home and benefiting from my support without any intention of working on our relationship. Her sister Brooklyn called me within hours of learning the truth, offering a tearful apology and revealing details about Autumn's manipulation that went back over a year, including how she'd been testing different stories about our relationship problems to gauge family support for a potential separation and build sympathy for her eventual departure. Brooklyn explained that Autumn had been systematically building a narrative about my supposed spiritual inadequacy and materialistic focus, preparing family members to support her eventual departure while portraying herself as someone whose consciousness had evolved beyond the limitations of conventional marriage and traditional relationship structures that supposedly held back her spiritual development. The family had genuinely believed Autumn was going through a legitimate spiritual crisis and had even offered to help fund her retreat expenses, not realizing they were being manipulated into supporting her affair through their emotional and financial contributions to what they thought was her personal growth journey toward enlightenment and self-discovery. Brooklyn's revelation that Autumn had been planning this deception for over a year added another layer of calculated betrayal that made her text message announcement seem like the culmination of an elaborate long-term strategy rather than a spontaneous spiritual awakening that had led to unexpected relationship changes and consciousness expansion that required separation from negative influences. The divorce proceedings became increasingly contentious as Autumn's attorney tried to argue that her spiritual journey was legitimate and that any relationship with River had developed naturally as part of her consciousness expansion work, attempting to minimize the financial fraud and systematic deception that our evidence clearly documented through bank records, surveillance photos, and witness testimony from other victims who'd been similarly manipulated. Chen's response was brutal in its precision, systematically dismantling every aspect of Autumn's defense while presenting overwhelming evidence of her calculated manipulation and financial misconduct that had violated her marital obligations and breached her fiduciary duty to our shared financial interests and joint savings goals that we'd worked together to achieve over 3 years of marriage. The court proceedings revealed the full scope of River's operation and how he'd been using his spiritual retreat center to identify and exploit vulnerable women for both financial and personal gain. Information that would eventually lead to criminal investigations and civil lawsuits from other victims who'd been manipulated through similar spiritual awakening scams designed to separate them from their husbands and their money while funding River's lifestyle and business operations. 6 months after the divorce was finalized in my favor, I had completely rebuilt my life with the kind of genuine peace and authentic happiness that Autumn had always claimed to be seeking through her expensive spiritual journey and consciousness expansion workshops that had cost me thousands of dollars and years of emotional investment. I'd moved to a beautiful one-bedroom apartment in Boulder with mountain views that reminded me daily of the real natural beauty Colorado offered without requiring expensive retreat centers or spiritual guides to access and appreciate properly. My promotion to regional sales manager came with a significant salary increase that allowed me to save money again instead of funding someone else's deceptive lifestyle and fraudulent spiritual awakening activities disguised as personal growth and relationship improvement work that had actually been designed to justify leaving our marriage. The settlement had recovered most of the money Autumn had stolen from our joint accounts, plus substantial additional compensation for her financial misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty that the court had recognized as particularly egregious given the systematic nature of her deception and the elaborate cover story she'd maintained while draining our shared resources. I'd started hiking regularly in the genuine Colorado wilderness, finding the kind of spiritual connection and inner peace that didn't require expensive workshops or guidance from questionable healers who specialized in exploiting vulnerable people during difficult periods in their lives and relationships. My new life felt authentic in ways that my marriage to Autumn never had, especially during the final months when she'd been living a complete lie while planning her exit strategy and new relationship with River through financial fraud and systematic deception that had violated every aspect of our marriage vows. Through mutual friends, I learned that Autumn's spiritual awakening had turned into a complete nightmare when River abandoned her for another client within weeks of our divorce being finalized, leaving her financially ruined and spiritually devastated by the realization that she'd destroyed her marriage for a man who'd been manipulating her all along for money and temporary companionship. The irony wasn't lost on me that Autumn had left me seeking authentic spiritual connection and consciousness expansion, only to discover that River had been running a sophisticated con game that preyed on women exactly like her who were searching for meaning and validation through expensive spiritual experiences and healing workshops. Phoenix Martinez, a mutual friend from our old social circle, ran into me at a coffee shop in downtown Boulder and provided updates about Autumn's situation that confirmed everything I'd suspected about River's predatory business model and exploitation of vulnerable spiritual seekers looking for authentic transformation and personal growth. Phoenix revealed that Autumn had moved back with her parents in Fort Collins after losing her apartment and most of her possessions when River's operation was exposed by authorities investigating financial fraud and elder abuse complaints from multiple victims across Colorado and Arizona. She was working at a chain wellness store for minimum wage, selling the same kind of overpriced spiritual products and healing crystals that she'd once bought from River's retreat center while believing they would transform her consciousness and elevate her spiritual awareness beyond conventional relationship limitations. The woman who'd once criticized my supposedly materialistic values and practical approach to life was now struggling to pay basic bills while dealing with the legal and financial consequences of her choices, including substantial debt from credit cards she'd maxed out funding her affair and spiritual journey that had been nothing more than an elaborate scam. Phoenix mentioned that Autumn had tried to contact several of our mutual friends seeking emotional support and possibly financial help, but most people had distanced themselves after learning about the systematic deception and financial fraud she'd committed while portraying herself as someone going through a legitimate spiritual crisis that required understanding and support from her community. I felt no satisfaction in hearing about Autumn's downfall and financial struggles, only a profound sense of relief that I'd discovered her deception before it could destroy me completely and gratitude for learning that authentic spiritual growth doesn't require betraying the people who love and support you through difficult times and life transitions. My new life in Boulder represented everything I'd actually been searching for: genuine peace, financial security, meaningful work, and the freedom to build relationships based on honesty and mutual respect rather than manipulation and deception disguised as spiritual enlightenment and consciousness expansion.